Okay, so welcome everybody. Today we're going to go through the zip form disclosures. I used to do all of the paperwork in one sitting, and the purchase agreement, the RPA, kept increasing in size, and so now that's a separate meeting. And I think we're up to about 75 pages here on this zip forms booklet. So this is available on our website. Login is sold, S-O-L-D, and you'll be able to download this, this booklet. We keep this updated. We usually update it at least once a year. Forms come out twice a year as CAR goes through the different forms. You know, I'm so old that in my RPA class, I always show the one-page purchase agreement that we used to use when I first started. Our company attorneys would write the forms, and it was one page, and all of the office managers got in a tizzy fit when they wanted to go to 2 pages. So, and there were no other disclosures at the time. So this was back in the dark ages, early 1970s. One page, and no disclosure, one-page purchase agreement. So we've come a long way. A lot more attorneys now, a lot more real estate agents, and hopefully a lot more money for us to earn in this business. So in this booklet, I've got it broken up into buyers, sellers, and buyer and sellers papers. And if you scroll down, I think we've got 70 pages here in this table of contents, 76 on this. And these are the typical. Let's go to that very last page in the booklet here. These are the disclosures that are typically needed for your file when you close a residential purchase. This is our checklist. Again, this is available in the office and on our website. It's a 2-page checklist, and it lists all of these forms. Again, this is for a typical residential sale. And there's literally hundreds of forms that are not on here. We're not touching into any of the commercial properties, into any of the rental or lease properties. And there's a lot of addendums and other attachments for most of these forms that you can also use. But these are the basics. And so I'm just going to kind of hit on the highlights of this. I'm not going to read them to you. One thing I found from these Zoom meetings is that we get a lot less feedback, a lot less questions. So if you have your video on, raise your hand or use the chat button at the bottom of your screen if you have questions, because otherwise you're just going to hear me for the next hour elaborating on these forms. Okay, so any questions, anything to, before we get started here? Also, regarding all of the new coronavirus forms, we've got about a dozen of those forms, and I think I'm going to do a separate Zoom meeting on that here in the next couple of weeks. These were updated as of the 13th. So what is that? 3 days ago. Most of these forms are new as of the 13th. They've been revisions from the ones that were done a couple of weeks prior. But if you have questions, specific questions on these, I'll be glad to answer them today. All right. So before, I think I asked, any questions as we get into this? All right, let's start with the agency forms. I know we've got, Scott's a brand new agent. Most of you have been around, so I'm not going to elaborate much on this. I'll give you some history. Agency was actually one of the first disclosures that was required in our industry, and that was because back in the 70s, the attorneys, there was actually lawsuits filed that stated, how can a real estate agent represent both sides in a transaction? And when an agency relationships, and under this topic, when we talk about an agent, they're talking about the agency. So they're talking about the broker. So even though we have close to 300 agents here at TRG, we're all under the TRG broker, under Lauren as the broker of record. So when two agents in our company, one representing the buyer, one representing the seller, that constitutes dual agency. And fortunately, back in the 70s, our CAR PAC money was used to fight the lawsuits, and we were able to get legislation that allows us to do dual agency in real estate and have the same broker represent both sides. However, and that's the big point here, is that we have lots of disclosures that go along with that. And it starts with this agency relationship disclosure. If you look at this form, this is basically the civil code right up here on the front and the back, and it lists the duties of the buyers and sellers agents. I'll let you go through this on your own. The key to this is that whether you're representing a buyer or a seller or a tenant or a landlord, anytime prior to having any paperwork signed, you need to have your client sign this agency disclosure form. And it basically states the different things that can happen in an agency relationship. And you're not stating in this form whether you're going to be just the buyer or just the seller's agent. If you notice here, it says, it just gives you information, and it's a disclosure on the different types of relationship. But this is a required form. Again, prior to signing any paperwork, this form needs to be signed. And in practice, when we print out a purchase agreement, for example, for a buyer, this will print out with it. And so you'll have this signed at the same time that they have the purchase agreement. Likewise, with a seller, when we're taking a listing, this form printed. The only difference, if we can scroll back to the very top of the agency form here, if you notice in those little stars I wrote there, the only difference in the forms, and this was a revision maybe 5 or 6 years ago, they actually put on here buyer's brokerage firm to buyer, and then they have sellers to seller, but they're all the same form. So it really doesn't matter which ones you use. You just have to have this in your file. Not seeing any questions on agency, we're going to move on here. We're going through the buyer's forms. The next form that we require in our file when you're representing a buyer is a buyer representation agreement. Zip Forms actually has 3 different buyer representation agreements. This is the code on this is BRNN, which stands for non-exclusive, not for compensation. And I'll come back to that. But basically the form says, hey, buyer, I'm going to work with you. And you can make some notes here under item 1C. You're looking for a South Bay property, something in the $700,000, $800,000 price range. And these are the different things I'm going to do to help you find that property. If you notice at the very top, there is a beginning date, right? But there's no end date. So this is unusual for a contract to be open-ended in this, but when you read this, it states that either party can basically cancel this agreement, and the other way is if the transaction completes, that's going to cancel this representation agreement also. So it's kind of open-ended, and hopefully your question is, well, gee, why do I even need this if it's not for compensation and it's not exclusive, etc. Well, if we go to the second page down here under item, I believe it's item 5, is that E, item 5E, and it's stuck in the depths of this contract. It states, and the buyer agrees to by signing this, that the buyer represents that he's not entered into an exclusive representation with any other broker to acquire property. So this is kind of like our flag that, hey, we're claiming you, buyer, to help you locate a property. No commissions, no exclusivity on this because you are not working with anyone else. All right? Questions? All right, so normally what comes up in our workshops is, you know, well, gee, this is kind of meaningless, right? If it doesn't really hold the buyer to any agreement. And so I like at this time to push forward and go into the seller's documents on a listing agreement. So that's the buyer's listing agreement, as I like to call it. And then this is the seller's listing agreement. And if you notice, right prior to this, we have the agency form, just like we did for the buyer. The only difference, if you look at the heading on this, it says seller's brokerage to seller. And then as we go down, oh, let me touch on one other thing under agency. So our PAC money allowed the real estate industry to do dual agency. We have a policy here at TRG, and most companies have a policy that they do not allow dual agency with the same agent. So even though TRG allows dual agency, we do not allow it with only one agent. So in other words, we'll take the risk of having 2 different agents in our company and doing dual agency, but we want to make sure that we have an individual representing each side, so that so that all of the pertinent stuff does not have to be disclosed if it's private between the client and their agent. And this comes into play specifically when an offer is being presented as to how to enter those negotiations. The other problem with dual agency and one agent, when you talk to any attorney, they will tell you that there's just no way to win any dispute because you've got one agent representing both sides, and either party can basically state whatever they wish to file a lawsuit, and we typically lose under those dual agency cases or mediations that we are involved in. Okay, so now we're comparing the listing agreement that we had with the buyer under that buyer representation agreement to the listing, seller's listing agreement that we have with the seller. So here's the form. I believe it's 3 pages. We basically just put in the price that the seller wants. We have the commission. If you notice that this one is written at 5%. TRG agents are given the authority to charge whatever they wish on this, but the important thing is that you state the total commission being charged to the seller, and then what is going to be shared on the MLS. And in this, it's 2.5%, and this is what goes on the MLS for the cooperating broker. Right? So again, these amounts can be whatever you want on this. Personally, I use a commission schedule, and I go through that when I'm in my buyer representation workshop that I do. I have a floating scale of commissions, and what I tell my potential seller is my commissions vary depending on the services, and it varies from 1% to 5%. And that gets me in the door when I'm trying to get that listing appointment. It's common when sellers will ask you, gee, what do you charge? And so you do not want to just tell them, 5%, 6%, 10%. You want to give them a range so that you can explain what your services are and explain that you are as competitive, if not more competitive, than the other brokers in the industry. I don't know of any company that supports their agents better than TRG because our commission schedule is so low, and we can actually make money in charging a 1% fee, for example, if your volume is high enough for that. Okay, so the important thing that I like to bring up on this listing agreement is under that number 2 and 3, if you notice I have that X'd out. When you read through that, if you recall back from when you took your exam, Scott, that's 2 days ago, typically on your DRE exam, there was a question about a safety clause in your listing agreement. Well, that's what number 2 is that's that safety clause that states that within blank number of days after the listing expires, that the listing agent is protected and can still get a commission if a buyer that previously saw the property ends up purchasing it. So there's some caveats to that, and when you read through this, is that you have to get that list of names of prospective buyers to the seller. I believe it's within 3 days of the expiration of the listing. And the reason I cross that out is in my career of decades, I've never had an agent do this. I've never had an agent give a list of buyers to a seller. Typically what happens is when you take a 90-day or 120-day listing, if the property doesn't sell within those first couple of months, it's usually because of the price or showing restrictions. There's some problem with the seller in that they're not cooperating. I've taken overpriced listings on the basis that the seller will come down, will drop their price every week or every 30 days, and so that we can sell it. And so if that property doesn't sell and you get down 90 or 120 days, it's been my experience that most agents don't want to deal with this seller anymore because of the problems that they've had in marketing this property. So it's very rare that a seller will get down to that end of the listing period and say, oh gee, we've got 3 buyers that really want to buy this property, but they're waiting for some unknown reason, and here's a list of them. So I cross it out. It's too difficult to even explain this to a seller that actually reads this. And likewise with number 3. 3 is what this states is that without the broker's prior written consent, if the seller, if you, Mr. Mrs. Seller, if you take this property off the market, you're still going to pay me this 5% commission. So if you ever have an attorney that you're representing or somebody that actually reads the contract, which may not even happen ever in your career, this does not make the relationship warm and fuzzy between you and your potential seller here. Early on in my career, I was representing an attorney and they're saying, well, I'm not going to agree to this, right? And so we crossed it out and initialed it. And so I've just made it my cause over the years and over my career to cross this out and to add up under 2B up there that the seller may cancel at any time. So this, to me, is one of the most important clauses that you can put into your listing agreement. And I'll explain why. I'll take a minute or two on this. The reality is when a seller lists their property with you, if they decide that they do not want to sell the property, let's say in a month down the road or 2 days down the road, what are you going to do, right? Are you going to charge them the commission? You know, typically, even though you may want to charge them, your broker is going to cancel this agreement. If someone is not happy with you, if they're saying, hey, you're not holding enough open houses, I'm not getting enough showings, I'm not happy, I don't want to wait 6 months until my listing expires, I want to cancel this. Well, but when they go to the broker wants to keep, they don't want that risk of mediation or these clients bad-mouthing our company. We're going to release them. And that's been my experience, and that's my advice to our new agents that are coming into this industry. There's a lot of business out there, and you don't want a disgruntled seller to have to deal with. And you certainly don't want to put a hold on their listing and keep this property off the market until the end of that listing contract, which you have a right to do, right? I release them. And it's been my experience over my decades that I may have been taken advantage of once or twice in my career by these sellers. But if you look at that clause that I write in, that the seller may cancel at any time, and you use that to your advantage in your listing presentation, you will knock the socks off your competition. If you're going up against another agent and they don't offer this satisfaction guarantee, and we build it up in our CMA and our presentation material, if you don't use that, you're not going to get the listing if the other agent is offering that. And the reality is they want to work with you and you want to work with them. So use that. And the reason I kind of go through this, let's finish up the rest of this listing agreement. It states the CRMLS. There's an opt-out box here that basically tells the seller, hey, if you don't want to put your property on the MLS, you're crazy, that they can read through that. And I tell you, in my career, I have never had a client opt out of the MLS. So if you have any specific questions on that or coming soon, see me so I can explain that. When a seller is ready to sell, we want everybody in the world to know about this property. So we want this to go live onto the MLS. If they're doing work on the property and they say, hey, I need a week, well, then you list it today, they sign everything today, but you don't have the listing start until next week. And that's on that very first page. It has a start date for that listing. Okay, so the rest of this, read through. This date prepared, if you notice at the very top here, this was prepared on March 1st, and the beginning date is March 1st, which is typical, but you could start it on the 10th if they need extra time. And that way you don't have to do the exclusion, you don't have to submit paperwork to the board of realtors, and it'll give you a few days to also get your marketing, your ducks in a row to get your flyers, get photos, and get that property marketing. Let's go back a little bit, a couple more things on this listing agreement. There's a representative capacity. We're seeing that more now. Scroll down a little bit at the very end. If there, I think it's on the last representative right here. Okay, so almost all properties now that are west of the office are in some type of a trust. So if it's in the Smith Family Trust and Bob Jones is signing for it, well, you need to have this representative capacity where it states in that separate form, right there, in that separate form that Bob Jones is the representative for the Smith Family Trust. So anytime that there's a trust, probate, any type of conservatory relationship, you need to have that representative capacity, an LLC also, to have them sign saying that they are the one that has the authority to sign in order to sell this property. Okay, so if we go back to the top of this, the reason why I like to go from the buyer's agreement to the seller's listing agreement is that looking at this off the surface, you can say the same thing as that buyer's agreement. Well, gee, you can cancel at any time, so this isn't worth the paper it's written on, right? Well, and that's true. We're not going to spend $40,000, $50,000 going through a mediation to collect a $25,000 commission. It just doesn't, it's not worthwhile, nor is it worth our time involved in doing this. So use it to your advantage. Use that seller may cancel at any time so that you will have the best presentation. And that's why when we go back to the buyer's representation agreement, that's how I counter when agents say, well, gee, this is non-exclusive and this really doesn't mean anything. Well, it does, because when you sit down with a buyer and you have them sign an agency agreement, you have them sign a buyer representation agreement, you go through the types of properties that they're looking for, you have them pre-approved by Jonathan in the office, and you spend this time with them, you are going to have these buyers locked in with you, especially with that pre-approval. You know, the old days of jumping in my car and let's go looking at properties, we just don't do that anymore. We have to sit down with them and counsel these buyers. There's just too much going on. I have a great buyer's presentation booklet that I give to my buyers, and it gives them these forms so that they have a chance to look at them. I don't think I do give them 70 pages, but I give them about 30 or 40 pages of the purchase agreement and the disclosures that they will be using. So, and when you spend that time in counseling that buyer, you're going to have them locked in with you, so that if they stop by an open house that has another agent, they are going to tell them that they have a buyer representation agreement signed and that they're working with Joe at TRG. Okay, any questions, any chats as we go on here under buyer paperwork here? This buyer inspection advisory, you can read that on your own. This is just the start of some of the disclosures. This BIE form, I'd like to take a minute on this buyer's inspection elections. This is not a required form by the state of California. The TDS, the transfer disclosure, the agency forms, obviously the listing agreements are required forms, but this is not. I think it's probably one of the most important forms that we have in our folders because what it tells this buyer is that, hey buyer, during your inspection period, whether it's 3 days, 10 days, or 17 days is the default on the purchase agreement, is that you have the right to inspect this property. But as an agent, we really don't tell them what that means. And so to have a buyer sign this form, it shows them, hey, there's 42 items here, or 37 plus notes, as to what you can do during your inspection. Typically the buyer, as I have checked here, the buyer has the general home inspection, and they'll get a pest control report either provided by the seller or their own termite company that they've requested. Again, we only have a few days in most cases to complete our inspections, so we have to be on the ball and know what we want to do. But what this does, and it gives buyers notice that, hey, you can also check for lead paint. You can check for, your chimney, if you feel there's a problem with the chimney, or if you're concerned about the soil stability, which we have some areas in Torrance that have expansive soil, you can hire at your expense, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, to get this checked out. But don't come to us after close of escrow and say, gee, I never checked the roof, or I never checked if this back room was permitted, because that is not our job as the agent. So hopefully you can see how this is not only important to the buyer, but it's also important for our file that we have this disclosure and that we've discussed this with the buyers. Okay, moving on. Oh, gee, it looks like we have a duplicate there. Oops. Old one. Okay. All right. We didn't delete the old one. Okay, so seller's papers, we've gone through the listing agreement already. We're going to skip through that. Time's flying here. No questions, no comments. All right. Arbitration agreement. Again, when I started in real estate, we always had arbitration agreements agreed to. Brokers have said, hey, you gotta do this. It tells the parties that they're agreeing to arbitrate, where if there's a dispute in a transaction, you can get it resolved in just a few months through a mediation. And if the mediation doesn't satisfy the parties, then they can arbitrate. And again, this just takes months. The other option without an arbitration agreement is that the parties can go to court to sue. Civil court now, I believe it's 3 to 5 years. I think they have to hear the case within 5 years. I don't know of any agent that wants to wait on a transaction to get resolution in 5 years, plus the expense of the attorneys. So it's been my experience that 9 times out of 10, there's never a question. The clients will always sign the arbitration agreement. This is built into the purchase agreement. They just initial this along with the liquidated damage clause on the purchase agreement. So it's very rare that there's a problem. Correct, yeah. If you're dealing with an attorney, they typically, and I've dealt with many attorneys in my career, most of them agree with the arbitration agreement. But if you have a litigating attorney, they are not going to agree to sign this. They want those protections that are offered in that court, in that civil case. We were actually told when I first started in the industry that, hey, we just don't represent you if that's the case. It's been my experience now, I'm older and wiser, that I realize over the last 20 years here at TRG, at most we're involved in maybe 1 mediation a year, and that's mandatory. Parties do not have to sign. That's part of our purchase agreement that they have to mediate. We've never had one go to arbitration. We've always had it resolved in mediation. So personally, if the client doesn't want to sign the arbitration agreement, to me it's not a big deal, because we've literally closed thousands of these files and have never had an arbitration. So knock on wood, but that's not going to happen here soon. Okay, moving on. Seller's advisory. Again, this is just another disclosure. Read through this. Interesting stuff on here, but I'm not going to take the time to go through it line by line. I'll let you read that. The buyer and seller papers, mainly this is the purchase agreement. It's now, I believe it's 10 pages. Our Lumlow Real Estate School, 10, yeah. We just updated our CE material that it takes about 6 months to go through the process to get the DRE to approve stuff. And so we got a draft from CAR for the new purchase agreement that's coming out. It was supposed to come out at the end of this year. I think they're going to delay it because of COVID. But guess how many pages in the new RPA?
Lesser pages, hopefully.
16.
Okay.
So we're going from 10 pages to 16 pages on the new purchase agreement. I've got a draft of it if anybody wants to look at this before it's published. My guess is it probably won't come out until March or April of next year. ZipForms typically has a release of new forms every April and every October, every April and every October, and they just kind of go through the different. There's literally hundreds of forms, and so they'll pick and choose which forms are going to update, and so most of them on a cycle of every 5 or 6 years they get updated. So we've got a new purchase agreement coming down the pike. Possible representation. This form is automatically printed out, and again, this is. I'm sure the attorneys said, "Hey, we got to have this form signed because even though I'm representing you, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer, we may be representing other buyers for that same property, and we don't want this to come as a surprise to you." So. If you notice, it talks about multiple buyers, multiple sellers, talks about dual agency again, and that offers may not be confidential because we're going to be passing them not only to our staff, but also to ultimately to the other agent in the transaction. So it's another disclosure. And you know, as we're getting into this, especially Scott as a new agent, and this is what I always enjoy doing this in my El Camino class. You get to this point where, and it usually hits you after about maybe 10 forms, it's like, who really reads that stuff? You know, when you sit down with a client and you have 70, 80 pages of disclosures that they need to sign, whether you're representing the buyer or the seller, and the short answer to that is that nobody reads it. But it's your duty to present that to them, and I particularly like when our agents present our booklets. We have a buyer booklet, we have a seller booklet that we give to our clients when we first meet them, and it basically has all of these disclosures in a sample form that they can read. You know, I've never had a potential seller come to me later and say, "Hey, Durf, I saw this FERPTA form in here. What is that all about?" You know, it's not that they are going to read it, but it makes those clients feel warm and fuzzy that you're disclosing all of this up front prior to them actually getting that form. And especially good for buyers. If you can give them that 10-page or next year, that 16-page purchase agreement, you know, days, if not weeks, prior to them signing that purchase agreement, it will give them the opportunity to go through that. And even though I'm guessing that 9 times out of 10, they never do, when you get to that point where you're sitting down and writing that purchase agreement, it's a completely different feel because this buyer, they trust and like you, they've had this contract, and they just say, "Okay, where do I sign?" Right? Again, they may or may not have actually read through that paperwork, but at least they've had that at their fingertips now for days. Market conditions advisory. This is just another general disclosure. Let's move on. Counteroffers. All right. So since we're really not getting into the purchase agreement, I really want all of our agents to download, or at least keep it on a PDF. You don't have to print out all these forms, but download the purchase agreement that I have in this ZipForms booklet, and also the counteroffer that I have in here, because the offer is written as though I'm representing the buyer. So I'm putting 30 days to remove to close escrow, 10 days to remove conditions. In the purchase agreement, you have 17 days and 21 days. So I'm putting this in to get this offer accepted. And there's no reason you can't get everything done in 10 days if you have that buyer approved. If you're representing the seller and you get an offer that comes in, this is how I like to have a counteroffer written, where you specify dates. Even though the offer said 30 days, pick a date that's obviously not including a Saturday or Sunday or a holiday, and preferably not Monday. So that gives you Tuesday through Friday to pick a date to close. I can't tell you how many discussions I have every month from our agents that do not understand the time frames. They said, oh, well, it was a 10-day condition or 17 days, but we didn't open escrow until this date. They didn't sign until this date, and they did. You want to make this simple, and it's easy to do. Put in a date. And again, I don't care if it's 30, 35 days or whatever, but put a date in, because if that 30 days happens to fall on the weekend, dollars to donuts, one party is going to want to close on Friday and the other one's going to want to wait till Monday, and it's just making our work more difficult. Same thing with the conditions. If you notice here, I have buyer to remove all conditions. There's 3 conditions, 3I and 3J, that's the appraisal and the loan condition, and 14B are the buyer inspections. Now those are 17, 21, and 17 days respectively as the default in the purchase agreement, right? But pick a date, and I don't care if it's 21 days or the 17 days. I prefer something quicker, maybe 10 days, but put a date on it so that everybody knows that we've got to remove those conditions. This is the contingency removal form, the CR form, and you want box number 2C is the one that is checked. Buyer removes all contingencies. I've worked with agents, and I'm sure the veteran agents have also, that they have different time frames. They've got 10 days for the inspections, they've got 17 days for the appraisal, they've got 21 days for the loan, and so they'll fill out 3 of these forms. Where they're going to remove the inspection condition, and they check that and say, you're just doing busy work, guys. You don't need to do those forms, because if there's still a contingency hanging out there, let's say that loan contingency is 21 days. Well, when that buyer gets those loan papers and he says, I don't like it, he can back out. And we can't read his mind. It might be that it may be because he's getting cold feet on the 2-bedroom house and he wants a 3-bedroom, or for other reasons. So whatever the contingency period is, have it all end on one date, and keep it simple, and use this form to remove all of the contingencies. Seller removal, that's only if the seller has a condition in there, and hopefully you'll never have to deal with that. All right, so again, another one of the state mandated forms is this TDS, the Transfer Disclosure Statement. Basically, the seller fills this out, and in their own handwriting. If you notice, you'll not be able to fill this out on zip forms. And the seller just checks off the different items that the property has, whether they're occupying the property or not, how old the roof is, and are they aware of anything that's not working, right? And, again, 9 times out of 10, nope, everything's fine, right? No problems. And that's why you have the seller do this exclusively. And then on page 3 of this TDS, the agents get to do their disclosure. When we first got this form, we would make a statement in here that say, oh, look at the inspection report. Look at the items on the inspection. Well, now we check that first box and we say, see the AVID. Even though AVID is not a state mandated form, I don't know of a broker that doesn't require this in their file, because this is 3 pages in which the agent has to go through the property and do a thorough inspection of the home. This is much better than just making a comment on that TDS form. If you're dealing with 1 to 4 units, you're going to need one for each of the units in here. So that's a 4-unit building. You're going to do one and label it for each unit, or a duplex, have one for each of the units. And just so I'll just spend a minute or two on this. I've gone through many seminars where we've had attorneys and specialists on these AVIDs, because this is one of the only forms that we fill out, that we actually put our comments on. What you do not want to put on this form is that, oh, I didn't notice, everything is good, everything is new, everything is fine, carpet is newly replaced, right? That's not the purpose of this. The purpose is to state things that are wrong with the property. And as the attorneys will tell you, is that you do not want to be very specific. If there are cracks on the sidewalk, you just state that there are cracks on the sidewalks. You don't say that there are 3 of them and that they're a ½ inch wide, right? We are not crack experts. And we do not want to be specific because we are not specialists. When you have black stuff in the back room in that dark corner on the wall, that's exactly what we state. Hey, there's black stuff in the back corner on bedroom number 3, right? We don't know if it's mold or mildew. I mean, and the reality is do you really know the difference between mold and mildew? I don't want to know if you know the difference, because that is not our job, right? So we just state the obvious, and the purpose of this form is to show a year or 2 later after this closes that we actually went through this property. I can't tell you that, I can tell you that I have sold properties before all of these disclosures where I never went in the property. The agent may have gone through it, or I may have sold it a year or 2 before, did the paperwork, sold it, never even went through the property. Well, that's unheard of nowadays. So you have to do this, and you want to be able to look at this form a couple of years after the close of escrow and be able to show that, yes, I was in the front yard, there's cracks on the sidewalk, there's cracks on the driveway. I was in the house, there's corrosion on the bathroom faucet, right? There's a tile cracked on the kitchen counter. There's marks on the wall and the carpet is worn. And I was in the backyard. The fence is leaning. There's cracks on the, I'm big on cracks. There's cracks on the sidewalk in the back patio or whatever, right? So, and that's the extent of our inspection. We don't climb in the attic. We don't climb under the house. We don't inspect every window to see if there's a crack in the window. We just look for obvious things to show that we did our visual inspection as mandated by state law. So those are the comments that you make on that AVID. All right. Any questions? Just raise your hand, chat, whatever. Turn your volume on, and I'll hear you. Lead-based paint. This has been around for a while. Notice, I don't think I've ever had anybody say yes. We've got dangerous lead-based paint in my career. And another thing is when you sit down with the seller, you've got all of the you've got the sellers filling out all of these disclosures. Typically, it takes me about 30 minutes to go with this, to meet with the seller and fill everything out. And it's likewise, it's about the same amount of time with the buyer. So you would think that, I mean, it's going to take me an hour just to kind of highlight these forms, but it goes much quicker in practice out there. All right, so this is your FIRPTA form. That foreign investment, this mandated originally, I guess, to keep sellers from laundering their drug money, so that we actually have some information for the IRS because escrow needs to report that. Another disclosure is this statewide disclosure. How many pages is this? 14 pages. When this came out, it was 10 pages, and it's grown to 14. Read through this at your, yeah, stop there on 47 there on the top. This is page 414, mold. Now, when I started at TRG, TRG had a separate mold disclosure. We had our own company disclosure that said, hey, your house may have this black stuff on the walls, and we don't know anything about it. We do not have any experience in this area, so you need to call in a specialist. So CAR, in their infinite wisdom, they did a mold disclosure, and it was a separate one-page disclosure. And then a few years later, when they updated this statewide 10-page, which is now 14-page, they condensed that mold page into a paragraph. It's one of, I think, 60 paragraphs here. And then if we can kind of go on down, you read this at your leisure. Oh, square footage and boundaries. Yeah, we've got a separate addendum now that talks specifically about square footage. But I like one of the last ones here about Megan's Law down here. I think it's number. Yeah, if your house was ever used as a methamphetamine lab, you have to disclose that. Right? Neighborhood restrictions, fire hazards. Oh, they've got it sectioned off. This used to be, I think, number 56 out of 75 different items here. So Megan's Law, this is a database of sex offenders. Before it went on the internet, there was an 800 number, and this is probably about 20 years old, and they had a separate form that everybody had to sign, and this is how this evolves into one paragraph now. And also, right below that, supplemental tax bills. If you've closed many houses, you've gotten calls from your new buyers saying, hey, the assessor's crazy, they're sending me 2 supplemental tax bills, they screwed up. And so the state legislature said, oh, we have to have this disclosure, and the state mandates this supplemental tax bill disclosure. Again, it was a separate form, and now it's stuck into this 14 pages. So obviously these are all important items. The reality is very few of your clients are going to read these. So you better know what is in these items for questions and advice that you can give your clients on this. Okay, so let's get into that SPQ. That's the next form here. This is probably one of the most important. I think I said that before. This is probably the most important form here. When this form came out maybe 10 years ago, the CAR attorneys, again, these are all California Association of Realtors specific forms to California. They're saying that every item in this property questionnaire was a major lawsuit in California. So it's very interesting going through these, and if you put your seller's cap on and you're selling your own property, that's how I like to look at this, is how you would answer this. The reality is that most sellers go through this and say, oh no, I don't have any problems, etc. But when you get down and you actually read this, have you ever had any defects under item C here? Any defects, past, present, or anything that you've even repaired that has to do with electrical, plumbing, water, sewer, etc., etc. Well, who hasn't? If you've owned a home, you've done repairs on your property, right? But everybody says no on that. Water intrusion, if you go down here, have you ever had a leaky pipe on here? Or I like pets and animals. Have you ever had any pets on your property? So, well, yeah, my kids are growing up. Danny had some goldfish, and I think he had a
dog, yeah.
No, I'm talking these small things. The hamsters. Oh, we had hamsters. Yeah. So, yeah, is that That's what they're asking you. Have you ever had pets on the property? Right? So if you go back, and let's flash back up to the very first paragraph on this SPQ, so that you kind of get an idea as to how to respond to a seller if they actually read this. In bold here under item Roman numeral 2 here, it says these representations are made by the seller, not the agents. Oh, I'm sorry, number 3. Note to seller, tell the buyer about known material or significant items. And that's actually underlined in the form. I didn't underline that. So that's pretty subjective. So I don't think it's really material that my buyer knows that we had hamsters or goldfish or poodles or goats, or you can see how this can get kind of crazy as to what one person may think is not material, while others, yeah, we're raising coyotes now, where others may say that, hey, it is material, because when I lifted up that carpet in the dining room, because I really loved your hardwood floors, I found all of these stains from your pets, and you never disclosed that. And now I want all of those replaced at your expense. So you know, you can see both sides of this, and that's why they ask these questions on here. But every one of these under landscaping down here, have you ever had any of your trees, plants, or vegetation on or near your property that has been infected with anything? Right? Well, yes. Right? All right. I think that's it. I think you get the point here. Neighborhood noise, so down here at the very bottom, they get into very specific things here, not just the motorcycle gang that lives next door that you have to disclose, but any odor, right? Any generators, how about pool equipment or air conditioning units from your neighbor, right? So they're very specific. Yeah, they're very specific as to what can be a neighborhood nuisance. So this is important that you understand what is being asked in this, even though the seller is going to take about 3.5 minutes at the most to go through this and check those no boxes on there. Okay, that's my time's running out here. Move on. This is the Earthquake Environmental Safety Booklet. This is a booklet that you email your clients from the zip forms form and they have to sign saying that they've received a copy of that. This is the actual report that the seller fills in. Notice that the seller can say, hey, I don't know, and put that down, all of these, and that is an adequate disclosure, right? We have done our job, but everybody has to sign that report. I've added this ETA, this extension of time addendum. This is a good general all-purpose form that you can use if you need to extend escrow, if you need to extend your listing, if you need to change price or terms, you can under additional terms. So this is a real catch-all form that you can do to make any changes. Rather than doing an addendum, I like this ETA form because you, again, contingencies, any time frames, use this ETA form to extend. That way you don't have to rewrite a new contract. Request for repairs. So when you're representing a buyer, that buyer is purchasing that property as is, as you will learn from reading the purchase agreement, but the buyer does have the right to request repairs, as it states in item 14 in the purchase agreement. However, you've got to tell your buyer that you're buying this property as is. You have the right to back out. I do not tell them they have the right to do this RR form, because sellers, especially in a market like we have today with multiple offers, they're selling a property as is. They want you to go away because they can get probably more money for the next buyer coming down the line. So you don't want to lose the transaction over requesting to have a doorknob fixed or a broken window replaced or other minor stuff that's, you know, $50 or $100. Let the buyer know that they do not have to purchase the house, but they're buying it as is. Anyway, this is where they would put in their requests, and then the seller can respond by saying pound sand, or hey, we'll give you $200 to fix these items. I recommend that you never have a seller do repairs, because in that purchase agreement, there's a laundry list of items that the seller has to do, and if they are doing repairs. One, they have to get permits. So everything that you do, if you replace a garbage disposal, if you make any improvements, the cities require permits for everything, and most sellers do not get those permits. They have to give copies of invoices. Everything has to be up to code. So there's all of these things that can come back to the seller and bite them. So don't have the seller do any repairs. They're selling it as is, and let's keep it that way. This wire fraud disclosure, read that as your own. You do not want to forward any wire instructions. Wayne just came in the office the other day. He has a new escrow. The escrow sent him wire instructions to forward to his client. That's a no-no. You don't do it. Have escrow contact the client directly, whether it's buyer or seller. Don't have them go through you, because those emails can be edited. Okay, carbon monoxide detector. Again, these are just disclosures saying, hey, we got to have these on here. Let's move on. And this is your goal here. You want to get to this VP, this verification of property condition. In the purchase agreement, it states that the buyer has the right 5 days prior to close of escrow to go through the property and make sure that there hasn't been any damage since we first looked at it when we wrote that offer. So this is where they can state, hey, there's a hole in the wall in this back room that was not there previously, right? This puts the seller on notice. This does not allow the buyer to not close escrow. This does not allow the buyer to delay escrow. It just puts the seller on notice that I've noticed these items and you are responsible for getting these fixed. In almost all cases, it's resolved by the close of escrow. If not, the only option is small claims court or a mediation if it's a major item. But again, it's very rare that we don't get that those items fixed or resolved prior to close of escrow. Checklist, I've gone through that. That's the end. I'll hang on here if you have any questions or comments specifically. I'll give you a couple minutes here. Raise your hand, turn your mic on. I finished this in record time. You know, I know these Zoom meetings stifle comments, so if I don't see any, you're welcome to call, email, or text me also. All right, so not seeing any comments. Thank you very much for attending the Zoom meeting on ZIP forms. Make it a great day. Bye-bye.